Keeping the body clean and following certain hygiene practices isn't just a modern human trait. Many animals, including insects, do it too. But since our species evolved in warmer climates, we developed a fantastic cooling system through sweat glands. Of course, it has its downsides. Sweat contains organic substances, and as they break down on the skin, it causes not just an unpleasant odor, but can also lead to various health problems. And working hard in the heat of summer without a way to clean up can become pretty uncomfortable. Your skin feels suffocated. Even Arctic peoples had methods to deal with dirt. Without access to hot water or heated rooms, they'd cover their bodies in seal fat, stand near a fire to melt it, and then scrape off the fat and dirt with bone tools. The idea that high temperatures help clean the body more effectively has been around for a long time. For instance, Native Americans in North America had sweat lodges, essentially tents, where steam was created by pouring water or herbal decoctions over hot stones. Similarly, in South America, indigenous peoples built temazcals, clay sweat chambers. In the 5th century BC, small structures covered with felt were described, where the Scythians would throw hemp seeds onto heated stones, according to Herodotus. By at least the 2nd millennium BCE, Egypt had its 2-story Rasul towers. Fires burned on the ground floor, heating the upper level, where people poured water over hot stones. Similar practices existed in ancient India, China, and later Japan, where bathhouses were called sento. Interestingly, the modern word bath comes from the Greek word for a bathing place, a broad term. The Greeks called their steam rooms laconica. These were simple single rooms with a central hearth. The Romans took things further, creating thermae, complexes with multiple rooms at different temperatures and pools. While baths were a great way to clean the body, they weren't solely about hygiene in ancient times. In many early societies, bathing was part ritual. Indigenous peoples and Scythians used hallucinogens during these rituals, not just to get a high, as we might say today, but as part of spiritual practices. As civilizations advanced, bathhouses became primarily seen as places for healing and socializing. After all, if you just wanted to wash off dirt, there were simpler ways that didn't involve burning a ton of firewood or spending hours in a steaming room. But if ancient bath practices are fairly well documented, the first thing most people associate with medieval baths is likely the Slavs or Finns. For instance, bathhouses are mentioned in the tale of Princess Olga's Revenge, suggesting they existed before Christianity reached the Slavs. Arab sources like Ibn Rushda's writings also hint at this. Despite how some movies depict pre-Christian Slavs as dirty and disheveled, evidence suggests otherwise. What about the Western neighbors of the Slavs? By the High Middle Ages, public bathhouses were common in cities. These could range from simple heated rooms with wooden tubs to steam baths where people used birch twigs to cleanse themselves. Tax records mention 26 public bathhouses in 13th century Paris. Craft and trade registries in Paris set bathhouse fees at 2 to 4 deniers, a modest price. Vienna had 29 bathhouses at the time, Wrocław had 12, but the leader was the small town of Baden, which, according to Poggio Bracciolini in the early 15th century, boasted 30 luxurious bathhouses alongside pools for commoners. Baden even featured a wooden tub with bathing figures on its medieval coat of arms. Still, despite the presence of bathhouses, medieval European cities were generally less sanitary than their ancient counterparts. Wealthy lords often bathed at home in private semi-basement rooms called soap houses. Clergy didn't shy away from bathing either. Benedict of Nursia, founder of the first European monastic order in the 6th century, wrote, "Prepare baths as needed for the sick, but let the healthy, especially the young, use them sparingly." The Augustinian monastic rules advised, when going to the bath or elsewhere, always go in groups of 2 or 3. In one account from 1045, the Bishop of Würzburg died when the ceiling of his bathhouse collapsed. In the 12th century, Saint Hildegard of Bingen recommended drinking herbal infusions in the bath to treat illnesses and using the same herbs to create steam by pouring them over hot stones. Historian Fernand Braudel noted that medieval people frequented bathhouses as often as churches, and bathhouses were taxed like mills, forges, and taverns. Spanish legal codes, known as fueros, outlined separate bathing days for men and women. Valencia's 13th century code stated men could bathe together on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, women on Mondays and Wednesdays, and Jews on Fridays and Sundays. However, not all baths had separate days for men and women. Often baths had women of easy virtue. Sometimes these establishments were places where married men and women would meet. In fact, there's a passage from a 14th century work by Giovanni Boccaccio. Ricciardo loved the wife of Filippello Figinolfi. When he found out she was jealous, he told her that Filippello had arranged a meeting with his wife at the bath the next day. However, things drastically changed in the 16th century. In 1546, King Henry VIII of England ordered the closure of public bathhouses. Around the same time, the number of bathhouses in Paris also began to decline. By the 17th century, under Louis XIV, they had all but disappeared. In 1526, Erasmus of Rotterdam noted, 25 years ago, nothing was more popular in Brabant than public baths. Today, they're gone. The plague taught us to live without them. Of course, the plague, whose major outbreaks occurred in the 14th century, was unlikely to have shut down bathhouses by the 16th century. More likely, Erasmus was referring to another illness. In the late 15th century, Europe was hit by its first massive outbreak of syphilis in 1494. Whether syphilis came from the Americas or had European origins remains debated, but it claimed around 5 million lives. To put that into perspective, the population of France at the time was about 15 million, and Germany had roughly 10 million. In 1499, the epidemic reached the Russian principalities. In the Domostroy, a Russian household manual, this disease was called the French sickness. Unsurprisingly, public bathhouses became hotspots for transmission, not just because of intimate encounters, but also due to shared items like towels. The bacterium could remain viable at around 50 degrees Celsius for up to an hour. Still, syphilis wasn't the only reason bathhouses fell out of favor. Starting in the 14th century, Europe entered a mini ice age. The climate grew colder and harsher. At the same time, we're all familiar with the amazing works of medieval blacksmiths, 15th and 16th century knight armor, and massive two-handed swords. But the real backbone of blacksmithing at the time was the production of tons of horseshoes, nails, and farming tools. During this period, new smelting furnaces, known as blauwafens, spread, followed later by towering blast furnaces. Metallurgy became a rapidly growing industry. For it to function properly, not only ore and skilled workers were needed, but also charcoal. Charcoal is made from wood, and its yield is about 4 times smaller than the original volume of raw material. According to some enthusiasts, a 16th century blast furnace could consume up to 50 trees, each 50 to 70 centimeters in diameter, in just one day. The eventual switch to coal in the 18th century came during a severe fuel crisis. By then, cutting down a tree could result in hefty fines. Coal, despite decades of trial and error to mine and refine it, became the cornerstone of the Industrial Revolution. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was in a predicament. On one hand, syphilis, spread through questionable relationships or shared objects, was untreatable. On the other, colder climates demanded vast amounts of firewood to heat homes, not to mention the growing demand from metallurgy. Public bathhouses became a luxury, an increasingly dangerous one at that. This fate, however, spared the Russian Tsardom, where baths were private rather than public. Due to its geography, Russia faced more pressing challenges, such as a lack of high-quality iron ore than a shortage of wood. Firewood, on the other hand, was typically abundant.